Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from the Irish Story website. If you get a chance, please check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish Story, so if you enjoy reading the articles on the Irish Story or our podcast here on the Irish History Show, please consider supporting us on the Patreon, and we really do appreciate it. There's a link in the show notes. You can find this episode and all previous episodes of the show on irishhistoryshow.ie. The podcast is available on all the podcast apps like iTunes, Spotify and Stitcher, and if you could take a moment to rate and review the show, we would really appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. Please let us know what you think of the episodes, as we really love to get your feedback. On this episode, it's just me and John, and for the first time in a very long time since the start of COVID, we're actually sitting together and recording this.
Yeah, it's just like old times, Cathal.
Just like old times. So we have our cups of tea here, and we're going to get into it. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the executions during the Civil War. And you've been on quite a few shows and writing some articles at the moment, and newspaper articles about this, haven't you, John?
Yeah. I was on RTE and I had a series of articles in the Cork Examiner the Examiner as it's now known, about this topic. And, you know, it's a fairly bleak and depressing topic. And one might wonder in some ways why we are bringing it up again and again. But it is the centenary. And I think it might surprise people in some ways that this topic has not been really very well researched until very recently. Like, even the legalities of it, the legal framework in which the executions happened has only very recently been researched. Some of the files were destroyed way back in the 1930s, but others were only opened very recently. So there is a lot that is relatively new to say about the executions of the Civil War, be they a very bleak and depressing topic in many ways.
Well, that is the thing. If we were going to talk about executions during the Civil War, we should really talk about sort of the history of executions during this period and the revolutionary era, going from famously the executions after the 1916 Rising, but also during the Anglo-Irish War, or the War of Independence, or Tan War, whatever you want to call it, how the British state, how they went about executing Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think you should even go back a little bit further. So, you know, if you go all the way back to 1798, which was the largest insurrection in Ireland before the revolutionary period, there was a lot of executions, and I'm not sure at all about the legal framework there. I'm not sure there needed to be much. But in the course of the 19th century, the British state actually used executions after rebellions quite sparingly. So they were quite nervous and cautious about doing it. So, for example, after the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848, all the leaders were sentenced to death, but it was commuted and they were transported to Australia. And the same is true after the Fenian Rebellion of 1867. So lots of people are sentenced to death, but none of them in Ireland were actually executed. Now, 3 were executed in England, famously in Manchester, for shooting a policeman while they were trying to free a prisoner. But these became world famous, certainly very famous in Ireland as the Manchester Martyrs. And this was what the British government was obviously very cautious and afraid of, because they were aware of the power of martyrdom in an Irish context. So when you come to the Irish Revolutionary period, this is the heritage that the British government has, or the legacy that they have. The outlier, as you just said there, Cathal, is 1916, because in 1916 there's martial law, there's a military man in charge, General Maxwell, and his attitude is, well, we execute as many as we can, and he's very much going on colonial precedent there rather than Irish. So Maxwell actually drew up a list of 90 names, and he was working through them, and he shot 16 of them, or shot 15 rather. Famously, Roger Casement was hanged later, until the Prime Minister Asquith said, wait, how many are you planning to shoot? And he said, 90 for now. And he said, no, stop. You know, this is Ireland. We can't do it. We have to do it a bit differently here. than we could do in somewhere like in Africa or in India or the Middle East and so on. So the 16 who were executed in 1916, of course, became the most famous martyrs probably of the Republican tradition. And, the fact of execution becomes almost a badge of pride. They went to their deaths bravely. They went like lions, some people said. And although it might have got exaggerated over time, the executions of the 1916 leaders really did feed into the growth of the Republican movement afterwards. Now, there was other things like the conscription crisis, the fact that Home Rule was never delivered, the First World War, and so on. But executions were a big deal, certainly in building the mythology of the new Republican movement. When you get to the War of Independence, or the Anglo-Irish War, the Black and Tan War, the British are again quite cautious about using executions. So if you look at, for example, Kevin Barry, who was one of the first to be executed formally in the War of Independence period, he has a military court-martial and he has a defence. Like he has the right to a defence, but Kevin Barry forewent it, if that's the right grammar. And later on, they execute people in a more summary way in the martial law area in Cork. It just needs, there's a secret military hearing and people don't get a defence. But in Dublin, to the end of the War of Independence, the Republican lawyer Michael Noyk defends them, and he gets some people off, some people he doesn't get off. But there were 20 executions during the War of Independence, some by hanging, the ones in the martial law area in the south by firing squad. But had the War of Independence continued onwards, the British were very nervous about applying full colonial methods in Ireland, but the plan was that Ireland would be ruled by a Crown Colony if the war restarted. And Macready, who's the Commander-in-Chief, says, well, that means 100 executions every month. So this is the way they would have done it elsewhere, I think, to be honest. But in practice, they were actually relatively sparing about using executions in the War of Independence.
Well, it's funny, as you mentioned there, Kevin Barry. Like, Kevin Barry is the big name that we remember for being executed during the War of Independence. We don't tend to remember the other people who were executed.
Yeah, the Forgotten Ten, they were christened later for that reason,
Yeah. Whereas when we think about Civil War executions, we know an awful lot of the names. We were pretty sure on the numbers. We thought it was 77, now it's 81. The Civil War executions live in the memory a lot stronger than the War of Independence memories.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of true. I mean, at the time, it was the opposite, So, like, in Dublin in March of 1921, there was a number of Republicans, I think it was 3 or 4, were executed in Mountjoy jail. And there was massive crowds outside, and there was a one-day general strike, and there was an ambush in Pearse Street later on in the day. But there was massive public outcry. The city had a general strike, which is no small thing. And that kind of, it fell out of the public memory for some reason. Why is hard to say, actually. It's kind of an interesting point. But certainly, in the post-Civil War Republican movement, the anti-treaty Republican movement, the executions of the Civil War are a central kind of founding element. So they certainly, in that tradition, remember the Civil War executions particularly, more so than the ones even before the truce.
Now, you touched on it there, talking about like military courts and stuff, but if we were to discuss the legality, back in this period when Ireland's part of the United Kingdom, there is a death penalty for a whole range of different things. And it's not unusual for people to be convicted of crimes like murder to be executed. But how does that differ in the context of a war?
Yeah, you're quite right that the death penalty is a routine thing in those days. There aren't that many hangings in Ireland in peacetime, but that's because there weren't that many murders, really. So if you were convicted of murder, you got the death penalty. And so there would be a number of hangings, every year. What's different in the period of insurrection, though, is that essentially to have a trial by jury and convict somebody of a political crime in Ireland is very difficult, and the British knew this. So throughout the 19th century in Ireland, normal courts would be suspended. Habeas corpus, which is the right to trial by jury and not to be arrested without evidence, is suspended all the time. And there's a series of coercion acts from the 1820s, the era of the Tithe War, through the Land War and everything like that. So suspending jury trials is a part of British rule in Ireland. And you replace these with various things, but ultimately with military tribunals is what they come up with in the War of Independence and the Easter Rising. So the context here is it's not quite martial law, or at least martial law is only partially declared in part of the country, but the military is going to handle trials of a political nature. Now, even within that, there's a difference. So in most of the country, you have a military trial, but they have a right to a legal defence and it's carried out in public. In the martial law area, where the military has been put in charge of the civil administration, there's no defence and it's a secret trial. And they're shot by firing squad. So it's a military punishment. So that's the context, that's the precedent for the death penalty at times of was known as insurrection in Ireland.
I think most people nowadays, when they think about the death penalty, they think about places like the United States. And if they see somebody get executed, it's like after 15 years of appeals, and it's gone through all these different stages, and the governor has finally rejected an appeal for clemency. But when we see people being executed during this period, you could be executed the next morning.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's true in Britain as well, and it's probably true in most of your other European countries too. So nowadays in Europe, we like to pretend we're so much nicer than the Americans, for example, and countries that have the death penalty. But that wasn't the case back then. The death penalty was a fact of life. What was unusual in Ireland was this tradition of insurrection and various techniques of putting it down, though. That was not common in Britain. So there had been insurrection acts and so on in Britain, but they hadn't been commonly deployed for the simple reason that there hadn't been that many rebellions in Britain in the 19th and certainly not in the 20th century.
So if we move forward now, and we move to the period where the treaty has been passed by the Dáil, and according to the treaty, you're going to have a period where there'll be a provisional government running things, and then a year after the treaty is signed, the Free State will officially come into being. So what is the legal situation? And this gets very grey and very murky. What is the legal situation in Ireland leading up to this?
You have this weird period after the treaty was signed, Cathal, and you know this, where no one is quite sure what the law exactly is. So it's a big fudge. The Irish interpretation of the treaty, or the Irish Republican interpretation of the treaty, is it's a treaty between two sovereign states, and the second Dáil approved the treaty, and according to the pro-treaty narrative anyway, the second Dáil is being melded into the institutions of the new Free State via the Provisional Government. So what that would mean that the authority of the land is the second Dáil and whatever legislation they had approved. Now, the British conception of it is quite different, that the assembly that matters is the Parliament of Southern Ireland, which was created in the Government of Ireland Act, that any law that was passed in Ireland previously is still in effect, that the courts and all of British ruled Ireland are still in effect, and not the Dáil courts, which were the ones set up by the Republican counter-state 1920 and 21. And the authority in charge is the Provisional Government, which is just a handover government from Southern Ireland, which is under the government in Westminster, to the government of the Irish Free State, which is a dominion. Now, it's, a political compromise probably requires fudge, but this results in an awful lot of confusion. And just for example, so you have two Supreme Courts in Ireland in this time. So you have the Dáil Court, which is the revolutionary, if you like, Republican Dáil courts, headed by a man called Dermot Crowley. He's the Supreme Justice. He had been in jail during the War of Independence. And you have the Supreme Court in Dublin of the British system in Ireland. Which one is the true one? Nobody's quite sure. You have a rival system of courts and people are using both. Now, in the course of the Civil War, one of these, the Dáil courts, gets wound up, as we'll talk about, and the other one, which is the descendant of the British court system, that's the one that gets adopted. But in terms of legality, it's not all that clear which law or whose law is really in place, certainly in the first half of 1922.
Well, we did a whole episode about the Dáil courts, and it is fascinating. It's a really interesting subject, that the revolutionary Irish Republican government that came into effect after the 1918 general election, when the Sinn Féin MPs who were elected set themselves up as a separate parliament, as TDs, but they have their own separate legal system then under the Dáil. So, interestingly, there would have been a lot of pro-treaty TDs who still see themselves as Republican and still see this as the stepping stone argument. How did they reconcile the type of things that you're talking about, that under this new dispensation, you sort of invalidates all those other things they've been claiming in terms of, like, that the Republic of Ireland exists, that it has its own separate legal system under the Dáil. How do they reconcile these type of ideas, or do they manage to? Well,
it's tricky and it upset a lot of people, but I mean, generally speaking, there's this fudge that they carry on through the first half of 1922, constructive ambiguity, it was referred to in a later decade of Irish peace processes. When the Dáil courts were finally wound up, it's under the pressure of civil war. So the outbreak of civil war changes everything. It forces the people who were pro-treaty to just cleave to the line, the government line, which is articulated by Kevin O'Higgins. And he says, look, the Dáil courts were just a tactic. They were inefficient. They were corrupt. Now there can only be one legal system in the country, and it's going to be the legally established one. Kevin O'Higgins himself is a barrister by training. But it did upset a lot of people. So, for example, George Gavin Duffy resigned over this because the Supreme Court of the Dáil courts under Dermot Crowley was shut down because they demanded the release of prisoners under a writ of habeas corpus. So the prisoners who'd been taken in the four courts were just imprisoned by the military. There wasn't any charge. And when Dermot Crowley, who was the Supreme Justice, ordered them to be released, he was arrested. And George Gavin Duffy resigned from the government in protest over that. So there was a certain amount of discontent over this. But basically, the outbreak of civil war forces people to cleave to the side that they chose. So in the case of the pro-treaty side, you have various tendencies. You have a lot of people on the pro-treaty side who viewed themselves as stepping stone Republicans and so on. But this is the side that they chose. They said that the Free State is the only game in town, the treaty is the only game in town, and the government must do what it has to do to defend it.
Well, that's the thing too, you mentioned there with the attack on the four courts, and whether it's accurate or not to describe it as the start of the Civil War. You could have that whole debate, but if we use that as a starting point, really, and that does a lot of things we're going to talk about regarding executions and legalities does spring from the attack on the four courts. When the new provisional government finds itself prosecuting a war against its opponents, the anti-treatyites, how does legality enter into all this in terms of the powers that they will have to prosecute that war?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about legality is, in the end, it's kind of a relative concept. So, for example, Kevin O'Higgins said, with regard to the executions, in the end, all government is based on force. And even the Supreme Court of the Free State, they passed a ruling saying Suprema lex salut populi, which means the supreme law is the safety of the public. In other words, the government can set aside normal laws in order to win the civil war because it's a threat to the state. So, a certain amount of it is kind of academic, I suspect. But the government's position is that the provisional government is there under the treaty. The second Dáil approved the treaty. There was an election and the pro-treaty side won the majority of the vote. Now, the third Dáil, elected in June 1922, was never allowed to meet when the four courts was attacked. And so when it did meet in September of 1922, after Michael Collins was killed and so on, because Michael Collins wanted to prorogue the Dáil until after the Civil War. Yes, there's a pro-treaty majority, and that's their position, that we are the elected government, we have the legal right to govern, the people who are against us are defying the will of the people, and so the full rigours of the state, what the state can brought to bear in them, must be brought to bear, because otherwise they will bring down the state into a state of anarchy, and everything that we achieved under the treaty will be lost. That's their position. So, in one way, they're saying we are the legally elected government and we're going to act within the law. On the other hand, they're saying we're going to do, because we are the legitimate power in Ireland, we're going to do whatever it takes to win the Civil War, be it legal or otherwise. And they, at various times, they actually say this quite openly. But it is a contradiction,
Well, when the Dáil finally does meet, the third Dáil, what legislation do they propose in terms of giving themselves these legal powers to prosecute the war?
Right, well, one thing you have to appreciate, though, is when the Civil War broke out, Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith and Richard Mulcahy, who was the military commander, they thought it'd be over in a week. They thought it'd be over when they dealt with these people in the four courts who were an extremist faction. And that didn't happen. So civil war broke out around the country. So then the next job is they have to take back the towns and the cities around the country, particularly in Munster, which they did, by the first week of August. And they thought it was over then. But then, the anti-treaty IRA resorts to guerrilla warfare, which it turns out they're much better at than conventional warfare. And the civil war drags on and on. So the thing that they thought would be over in a week is dragging on into months. And the policy of the anti-treaty IRA under Liam Lynch is to drag it out specifically as long as possible, to target all the sinews of government, so be it the infrastructure, be it tax, be it preventing them from setting up a police force, the civic guard, preventing the government departments from functioning, to bring down the state in this way by a process of kind of attrition. And the government realises that this is beginning to work. So they're spending loads of money. They have to recruit tens of thousands of people into the army. They can't collect taxes in many rural areas and so on. And they realise they have to bring this to an end. And also another thing to bear in mind is, in the field, what you find actually is that their troops, the National Army, are suffering more casualties than the people they call the irregulars, certainly in terms of killed. Now, there's more anti-treatyites being arrested. But in the field, the National Army is taking out reprisals of its own. So by the figures Republicans have compiled over the decades, there have been over 40 prisoners killed in the field by September 1922 by the pro-treaty soldiers.
And this is surrendered prisoners.
It's a mixture. So it's some people are assassinated, they're sought out and assassinated. Some people are finished off while wounded. Some people are prisoners and then they're killed as prisoners. Yeah, there's a mixture. I mean, in two cases actually, in Emmett Dalton down in Cork and a guy called Martin Hogan, who was based in Kerry, they had actually formally executed people, which no real legal sanction at all. But Emmett Dalton had executed a soldier for giving arms to the anti-treatyites. Martin Hogan had held some sort of trial, kangaroo court, I suppose, down in Kerry, and executed a man called Lawler. But the government said we need to reimpose discipline over our forces, and we need to do something to crush this campaign to bring it to an end. In September 22, they bring before the Dáil what they call the Public Safety Act. Now, again, I think we've been through this before in this show, but the Provisional Government can pass new legislation. So under the Free State's constitution, legislation comes from the King, and it needs the assent, the royal assent via the Governor-General. There's no Governor-General yet. The Free State isn't formally set up at all until December the 7th, 1922, etc., etc. In any case, the government basically just ploughs ahead anyway. Technically, legally speaking, it's resolution of the Dáil, so it's not found in the statute book today. But the Public Safety Act says anyone bearing arms or assisting someone bearing arms against the state can face the death penalty. And they will have a military trial. So it is in line with previous British practice. Now, which is understandable because it's the only precedent that they have. Now, there is a stay of execution, to mix my metaphors, for 2 months. So they passed this in September of 22. There's nobody executed in September and there's nobody executed in October. And the anti-treatyites don't really think that they're serious, I think. You know, in the Dáil, they got a certain amount of pushback, so the Labour Party are not too keen about this. And Thomas Johnson says you can't just give power of life and death to people who've only just recruited into an army with no training, let alone legal training. The anti-treatyites don't really think that they're serious. But in November 22, they decide to show that they're in earnest, and they execute the first 4 in Kilmainham Jail in Dublin.
Who are those people that they executed?
Well, there are 4 young IRA, anti-treaty IRA members in Dublin, and I think 2 of them are still in their teens and 2 of them are in their early 20s. You know, they were captured bearing arms and they were shot the next week, I think. You know, they're really very summary process. The trial was held in Wellington Barracks, and that the records of all these trials were destroyed later on, so we don't have any record of that. But the relatives found out the morning after they were executed. So they were executed early in the morning. And in one case, you know, the mother said she was going down to the post office to post her son in jail a food parcel, and she saw a newspaper sign saying he'd been executed. It has enormous kind of shocking force, I think, the first executions. I mean, I don't think anyone really expected them to do it.
Well, this leads on to these preliminary executions.
Yeah.
Lead on to a much more famous set of executions, and probably the most famous set of executions during the Civil War.
Yeah, so Erskine Childers, who had been a particular hate figure on the pro-treaty side, possibly, I think, because, well, there's a number of reasons. So Erskine Childers was born in England, and he was an Anglo-Irish kind of Protestant type, and people like Arthur Griffith had always said he's not one of us, kind of thing. And secondly, I mean, Childers had been the secretary in the treaty delegation, and although he wasn't a plenipotentiary, he had kind of really urged his cousin Robert Barton and George Gavin Duffy and others not to sign the treaty. And then in the treaty debates, he was kind of very patronising, and he said a lot of things which they really didn't like. So he said things like Griffith and Collins didn't understand the treaty, that they'd sold out the country, and that it wasn't going to be a dominion at all. It wasn't going to be independent, even as much as Canada and Australia. And then during the Civil War, Childers was the head of Republican propaganda. Now, for whatever combination of these reasons, they really hated Erskine Childers. Childers was captured in early November in his family home in County Wicklow, which is, you know, it was a big house, landed estate, but in possession of a small 32 caliber pistol. So people have said to me, you know, a 32 caliber pistol can be deadly. It could, but it's certainly not an offensive weapon, you know. It's at best a kind of a personal defense weapon. according to the Eamon de Valera, it had been given to Erskine Childers by Michael Collins as a present in earlier times, in happier times, when they'd all been on the same side. I'm not sure about that. That's Eamon de Valera said that. But it's quite clear Childers is made an example of, right? Because there's plenty of people who were captured in action having actually killed National Army soldiers, having been in charge of barracks, attacks and ambushes and so on. The example I always use is Ernie O'Malley, who was captured the same week, who had actually killed a soldier, when he, in this particular gunfight when he was captured, and he'd killed several others in other incidents as well, by the way. And O'Malley's not executed. So Childers is singled out. He has a kind of a summary military trial. His legal team appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, as I said, whatever the government needs to do to win the Civil War is legal. His legal team appeals again, and while the appeal is pending, he's shot in Beggar's Bush Barracks.
It was funny, I was just looking on Twitter during the week and I just saw a picture from outside Crow Park where somebody had graffitied up on the wall, "Revenge for Dick, Liam, Rory and Joe," and that's what we're going to get into next.
Yeah, so, Childers is shot, and, on the other side, Liam Lynch, who's the head of the anti-treaty IRA, issues these orders saying that anyone who voted for the murder bill, which is what he calls the Public Safety Act, will be shot, and he says Free State supporters are traitors and their houses should be burned, and so on. I mean, first of all, there's more executions after Childers. There's another 4 shot in Beggar's Bush. But then Lynch's orders are acted on, and Sean Hale's TD was killed on Ormond Quay in Dublin, coming out of the Ormond Hotel with Padraig O'Malley, who was the Deputy Count Corla of the 3rd Dáil. And in reprisal for that, as you've referred to, 4 senior Republicans who were captured in the 4 courts back in July or late June 22. So Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey and Dick Barrett, memorialised in a Republican poem, Rory and Liam, Dick and Joe, hence the graffiti. They were taken out and shot. And, this is probably the most notorious incident because there is no legality here. So they had been imprisoned back in the 4 courts in July. They hadn't been charged with any offence. They had nothing to do with the assassination of Sean Hale, so they're executed in retaliation for something they could have had nothing to do with. And they're never charged with anything. There's just a piece of paper issued to them saying that you are being executed in reprisal for the murder of Sean Hale's TD. And of all the acts that the government committed in the Civil War, this is the one which drew the most opprobrium from their own supporters, in the press. And in the Dáil, for example, the Labour Party, I think Thomas Johnson, the leader of the Labour Party, said, "I think you've killed the Free State, by this act, this abominable act. You've killed the Free State because those were prisoners in your care and you've murdered them." He says there's no other word for it. But even like the Irish Independent, which is very pro-treaty in its line, it says, we support the government because the government is the legal government. They can't go around doing things like this. This is illegal. This is murder. And Kevin O'Higgins, as I referred to before in the Dáil, who's the Minister for Home Affairs, the equivalent of what today we call the Minister for Justice, says, ultimately all government is based on force. He said, Richard Mulcahy, who holds the position at the time of Commander-in-Chief and Minister for Defence, says to the effect, I suppose you'd be happy if more TDs were killed then. This is the only way to protect them. It's funny, Mulcahy really embodies in that statement the mentality of the IRA, if you like, the pro-treaty IRA who were in the National Army. They still have the IRA mentality that, if they kill 3 of ours, we'll kill 4 of theirs. It's something. It's an interesting thing that they take that into the Civil War, and a lot of the Civil War's worst atrocities, or some people use the word excesses on the pro-treaty side, most of them are carried out by people who had been in the IRA before the truce.
Well, this is the interesting thing as well, is that a lot of the people who are executed are not prominent Republicans or didn't play a prominent role during the War of Independence, but those 4 men did and hold very prominent positions within the IRA. But when we're talking about executions and the Free State Cabinet discussing these executions, they're discussing executing comrades of theirs and friends and people who they had very close relationships with before the treaty was passed.
Yeah, and famously about the Mountjoy executions, this is always repeated, but it never ceases to shock. So Rory O'Connor, who had been behind the occupation of the 4 courts in the first place, was a good friend of Kevin O'Higgins. He was the best man at his wedding. And so when I think Cathal O'Shannon of the Labour Party said in the Dáil, this is just personal vindictiveness, and O'Higgins gets up, clearly emotional, and he says, personal spite, vindictiveness. Great heavens, this man was a friend of mine. So, it does take a personal toll on them. And yet, that's the only incident really where very senior Republicans are executed. Childers and the Four in Mountjoy out of 81 executions. Generally speaking, they go for small fry. And probably the reason is because they did not have personal ties to them. So this is an exceptional event. It's intended as the starkest reprisal possible. Otherwise, they're doing kind of exemplary executions. What the cabinet discussions about this in late December 22, January 23, they show a very kind of ruthless vision. But the vision is actually, though, and this is something that I've been trying to push back on in the history of the Civil War, the history telling of the Civil War this year, is people always say the Civil War was decided in its first weeks. It was a cakewalk for the Free State. And that's not the case at all. It would never have got so bitter if that was the case. In December 22, the Free State think that they're losing. They think that the Civil War is bankrupting them, that they can't afford to pay for the army. The army is not up to the job of crushing the remaining guerrilla resistance, of establishing the functions of the state. And they're quite clear about this. They're saying winning militarily is not the thing here. We're failing to establish a working state. And unless we do this, we're sunk. We'll lose. The Minister for Agriculture, Patrick Hogan, says the public will give up if the irregulars are allowed to continue their particular form of warfare, by which he means sabotage and destruction and so on. And so they actually up the ante for executions in 1923. So their single biggest month for executions is January 23, where they execute 34 people around the country. And they do away with most of the legal framework around it. So previously there was a military trial, which, was carried out in secret and so on. But from January 23 onwards, it just needs the signature of 2 army officers to carry out executions. And sometimes you didn't even really get that. So, for example, in Tralee in January 23, Paddy O'Daly, who had recently taken over command of the National Army in Kerry as General Officer Commanding the GOC, he captures 3 Kerry anti-treaty IRA volunteers who had been involved in derailing a train where the 2 drivers had been killed. And there's a phone message which is preserved in the military archives from O'Daly to the government saying there are 3 very bad cases here who were involved in this outrage on the train in Tralee. I want permission to shoot them. And the permission comes back, and the next morning they're shot. So as far as I can tell, there's no legal process at all. There's O'Daly saying these were the men behind it, the government saying, yeah, go ahead and shoot them, and that's it. So whether they were or not is basically irrelevant. It's done in this mentality of the reprisal. And you see this around the country. The other thing you see in 23 is they sentence a lot more people to death than they actually shoot. So they sentence nearly 500 to death in total. Of those, 81 we know now are shot by firing squad. And about 400 are put on death row, as they'd call it in America. So they're waiting to be sentenced, but they're effectively kept as hostages. Now, to give an example of this, up in Donegal, they had captured the more senior anti-treatyites there, 3 of whom were from Kerry, actually, because they'd been sent there in early 22. Back in those days, planning to do a joint offensive into Northern Ireland. But by this point, they're the enemies of the Free State. They're in prison in Drumbo Castle. And there is a Free State officer who's killed. He's shot dead. And the 3 of them, plus another man from County Tyrone, were taken out and executed. And again, they had nothing to do with the soldier who's killed. It's a reprisal. And afterwards, they take Peadar O'Donnell, who is another senior Republican who had been a member of the Four Courts Garrison, but he's from County Donegal. And O'Donnell, in later years, becomes very famous as the most prominent left-wing Republican. O'Donnell, in many ways, later reframed the whole anti-treaty conception of the Civil War as kind of a class war and so on. But in any case, O'Donnell is taken to Donegal and O'Donnell is sentenced to death. And the anti-treatyites in Donegal are told any more activity, and O'Donnell is the next one who gets the bullet. And so this is the way that executions are used. Now, in some areas, in places like Wexford and Kerry, the executions probably just provoke more reprisals on the other side. Let's be honest, this does work. There are lots of areas of the country where people say, if we do any more, our lads in jail will be executed. So it does have a terrorising function, and it does work in a lot of the country. There's other big batches of executions in 23 in Athlone and in Tuam and in Ennis. Those are the biggest locations for executions, rather than Cork and Kerry, interestingly, where the anti-treatyites are strongest. And they're generally, again, in reprisal, but they're ferocious reprisals. Like, they'll take 5 or 6 men out of jail and shoot them. So the ones in Tuam are in response to an attack on a barracks in Headford, where there's 3 or 4, I think, National Army soldiers killed, and so on. The ones in Ennis, I think, if I remember correctly, are the last ones done in the Civil War. And County Clare, by that point, had been fairly quiet for a long time, but something had occurred, and it was just after the IRA order of a ceasefire, but before the dump arms order. And there's, I think, 4 or 5 executions in Ennis at that time. But that's the way executions are carried out in 23. They're carried out in a very cold-blooded, kind of systematic way in order to try to terrorise the anti-treatyites into calling off their campaign. Now, did it work? I think it has a terrorising effect, certainly, but it's much more common for people to be arrested than to be executed. So which of the two is more important is hard to say. But the other thing is that it just provokes this tremendous bitterness. And one example of this is in County Wexford. This is a famous example. In Civil War history, it is anyway. So 4 anti-treaty volunteers are executed by firing squad in Wexford town. And in the days afterwards, an anti-treaty column under a man called Bob Lambert, which was very active in South Wexford, came across 4 Free State soldiers or National Army soldiers drinking in a pub in Adamstown, County Wexford. One of them was shot and wounded, but the other ones were taken away and they were executed in reprisal for the ones in Wexford. So this is what it develops into, like an eye for an eye. The fact is the Free State has a lot more eyes. They could do it a lot more.
The one thing that's interesting there, especially, is you're talking about the dubious legality of the executions and how easy it is to get sanction to execute somebody, and they have this massive amount of anti-treaty prisoners at that stage that they can pick from. Why do you still see so many just murders of anti-treatyites who are taken? Why don't they even go through the process of the kangaroo court?
It's an interesting point. I mean, some of it comes down to kind of the different mentalities involved. So you have the likes of O'Higgins, the Minister for Home Affairs, who was very insistent that if there's executions, they must be done in this legal manner, this legal framework, however dubious that is, as you're pointing out. On the other hand, you have commanders in the field, and people like Paddy O'Daly is the most extreme example in Kerry, who have another mentality, an IRA mentality, I think you can describe it as, where it doesn't matter about legality. They kill our boys, we're going to kill 4 of theirs in response. So, like, O'Higgins is actually quite upset by the famous atrocities that happened in Kerry in March 1923, where 20 anti-treaty prisoners are blown up in 3 different incidents. Well, no, not all of them are blown up, but there's 20 killed. Most of them are blown up by these mines in reprisal for a bomb at Knocknagoshel in North Kerry, where 5 National Army soldiers were blown up. O'Higgins is upset not that people are being killed, but that they're being killed illegally, which is interesting. Richard Mulcahy, his great rival inside the government, like, there's a great deal of friction within the government, covers for the people involved. I don't think he's necessarily that happy, but he covers for them because he is also, in many ways, of this IRA mentality. But there is another facet to it as well. So in Dublin particularly, and to an extent in Kerry also, you see a campaign of clandestine assassination. So they're seeking out people and they're just shooting them. They're bypassing the middleman altogether. Some of them are reprisals. What goes on in Kerry is mostly just revenge. But in Dublin in 23, to decapitate the remaining cells, if you like, or ASUs, the IRA would have called them, of the anti-treaty IRA in Dublin, people like Bobby Bonfield, Thomas O'Leary, Martin Hogan and others, who were some of the main players in the IRA in Dublin, they're sought out by plainclothes, usually CID, Free State intelligence, and they're just driven outside the city and shot dead. They just cut out the middleman altogether. And there's a certain amount of government knowledge about this for sure. So certainly in the case of Bobby Bonfield, and Bobby Bonfield, by the way, was an active anti-treaty guerrilla, and he'd assassinated a pro-treaty politician, Seamus Dwyer, by his own hand, among many other operations. But Bonfield was arrested by the bodyguard of W.T. Cosgrave, who was the president, so what we'd call the Taoiseach, on Stephen's Green. Cosgrave witnesses his bodyguard, Joe O'Reilly, bundle him into a car, and the following day, Bonfield's bullet-ridden body is found on the Naas Road, in those days outside of the city. So, there's revenge in the field, there's reprisals, but there is also a certain amount of just very cold-blooded campaign of assassination in 1923.
But that's the thing too, you're talking about people like Bobby Bonfield, who have a prominent role in the anti-treaty campaigns. But you're also seeing people being killed who are like the Fianna boys, and we're talking about like the Red Cow murders and stuff like that. Like, what's the rationale for things like that?
You know, that's a slightly earlier phase of Free State reprisals, though, I'd say. The targeted assassination is right at the end of the Civil War, where in some ways they've kind of got their act together a little bit. The thing about killing the Fianna in Dublin, so there's two very prominent incidents. There's Sean Colin Alcolly in August 22, and there's 3 teenagers who were killed at the Red Cow in October 22. They're basically acts of revenge, I think. So the Colin Colley, most likely in response to the death of Michael Collins. The 3 Fianna boys in the Red Cow, Hughes, Holland and Rogers, were putting up posters calling for the killing of the murder gang. So the pro-treaty intelligence. And they're captured by those exact same people. And there's this very strong narrative on the pro-treaty side, particularly among the IRA veterans, that they are the true Republican soldiers and the people on the other side are Fusiliers and they're young lads who had never fought the British. And it really seems to have enraged them to find these young lads who hadn't fought the British fighting against them, I think. They're acts of revenge. I think there's no real sense in them, to my mind. One thing I want to flag there, though, I've talked a lot about the IRA and the pro-treaty army, the National Army. They are probably a majority in the officer corps in the National Army at the start of the Civil War. They're a minority even in the officer corps by the end of the Civil War. By the end of the Civil War, the National Army has changed a lot. You have a lot of people who hadn't served in any army, but you also have a lot of former British Army, including former British Army officers. Now, I'm Irishman here, I'm talking about. But generally speaking, though, and I mean for all the opprobrium that Republicans naturally held for people who'd been in the British Army, not really in Ireland now, but in the British Army, and now served in the Free State Army or the National Army, the reprisal thing mostly is the province of the pro-treaty IRA men. Who took the Civil War very personally.
So how did the anti-treaty IRA activists and leadership describe the effect that these executions were having on the morale of the anti-treaty IRA volunteers and also the wider support movement?
Yeah, it really seems to have shocked them profoundly. So Liam Lynch had been a moderate in the treaty split. You know, he was looking for reconciliation up until the Four Courts was attacked. But then even after the Civil War broke out, he writes general orders saying, we can't fight this war as ruthlessly as we fought the British. You know, you can't kill unarmed soldiers, you can't kill informers and so on. And this executions really changed him, or really changed his attitude. You know, and he issues these increasingly bloodthirsty orders, which fortunately were for the most part not followed, so that every Free State supporter is to have their house burned. Anyone who voted for the murder bill is to be shot, all the TDs and so on. And he constantly reiterates this. He's constantly writing to the IRA in Dublin and Cork and elsewhere saying, why aren't you killing the TDs? You know, that's one thing. I mean, it really increases the bitterness. Like people like Todd Andrews, for example, writes of his shock. He said, the reprisals, he writes, I could almost understand, but the executions, you know, the cold-blooded taking out of your former comrades and shooting them, that I could never forgive. So it's a long-standing course of bitterness. But in the course of the Civil War itself, though, you really do find examples where people surrender to avoid their comrades being executed. So, for example, in South County Dublin in Dalkey, there's a Dalkey column, believe it or not, which kind of wreaks havoc in that area in the anti-treaty IRA. It's hard to imagine guerrilla warfare happening in Dalkey, but there you go. They're cornered in a house in Glenageary towards the end of the Civil War in April, I think, 1923. The leader, Paddy Darcy, gets away, but he's informed that the ones who were captured there will be executed unless he surrenders. Now, Darcy does an interesting thing. He doesn't actually surrender himself. He gets the other remaining members of the column to surrender and bring in the weapons, which is a death sentence in the IRA, by the way. It's a capital offence by the IRA's own rules. But he gets away with it. Darcy himself remains on the run, but he surrenders the rest of the column and their weapons, so the men are not executed. There's several other examples like this around the country. But to show the depths of kind of viciousness that the Civil War reached, there are also a couple of examples of people who surrendered and were shot anyway.
Well, this is fascinating, and you talked about this in your recent Irish Examiner column. Can you go into that, please? Yeah,
so there's 2 cases that I know of. So there's a case in County Meath in March 1923 where 2 IRA column leaders, Greeley and Keegan, one of them, Keegan, I think is a false name. His name is really Meany, if I remember correctly. So they're captured after an armed robbery at Oldcastle. And they surrender. They call on the men under their command to surrender. Well, it's not they're captured, but they call on the men under their command to surrender. They point out arms dumps and so on, and they're executed anyway. And interestingly, the IRA also disowns them afterwards, so they're not included in the roll of honour of the 77, because maybe because they were captured doing an armed robbery, but maybe also because they denounced the cause after they were captured. There's another case which is a real outlier in many ways, but it's an interesting case. There's a man called Reginald Hathaway, who was an Englishman who had been in the British Army in the War of Independence and who had deserted. Now, following the truce, he joined the National Army, the Free State Army, and he deserted that as well. And he went over to the anti-treaty Republicans, and he's a very active member of an anti-treaty column led by a guy called Tim Aero Lyons. Now, it appears actually that Hathaway had surrendered at some point in 23 and come in and signed the form, which is pledging not to bear arms against the government. But then he went back into the field again with the column, it seems. Now, he's captured for a second time when the column is cornered in a place called Clashmealcon Caves, which is on the coast of Kerry. It's a very gruesome incident. So Lyons is killed, several other members of the column are killed, there's 2 Free State soldiers killed. The 3 survivors, including Hathaway, were found to have signed the form earlier, that is, come in and surrendered, and then went out again, and they're found wearing Garda uniforms. So they had raided a civic guard, or what's now being called the Gardaí, barracks, and taken their uniforms for clothes and so on. But Hathaway, to save his life, offers to go out and identify all the arms dumps in the area, because this is how an IRA column operates by April 23, which is, the arms are hidden and you just go and you get them when you need them. So he goes around and he points out the arms dumps and he points out people in the area for arrest. And this is all in the military archives, it can all be seen. And then they shoot him anyway. So Reg did not manage to save his own life, even by surrendering for the second time.
No, and it seems there'd be few tears shed on any side from after all that.
I suppose, but Reginald Hathaway is included in the Republican Roll of Honour nevertheless.
So another name we should discuss as well is Liam Deasy, and how that impacts towards the lowering of morale and the end of the anti-treaty campaign in the Civil War.
Yeah, so Liam, I probably should have mentioned Liam Deasy already in this context, but Liam Deasy is the very senior member of the anti-treaty IRA. He's the commander of the 1st Southern Division, which is Cork and Kerry and Limerick and Tipperary, so the anti-treaty heartland. And he is captured in February of 1923, and Deasy calls on the men under his command to lay down their arms and saying, it's all for nothing. And by that, he avoids execution. So, wasn't formally sentenced to death, as far as I'm aware, but the perception is certainly that Deasy avoids execution by calling on the men under his command to surrender. And certainly, if you look at the anti-treaty correspondence of the time, they do blame Deasy for their morale collapsing. So men started coming in to surrender and signing the form and so on. And Deasy's version, which he later lays out, and Deasy is eventually expelled from the IRA for this in prison. Deasy's version, which he later lays out in his memoir, is that he was convinced the Civil War was a bad idea by this point, and he would have done it anyway. But it was just a coincidence that it saved his own life. Now, I think that the position of calling off the Civil War by February 23 is quite respectable, actually, quite responsible thing to do. But certainly in the IRA, the view was that Deasy had done this just to save his own life. So he's expelled from the IRA for this after the Civil War.
So as we get to the end of the Civil War and the famous Dump Arms Order, is that the end of the executions and the reprisals?
More or less. There's a batch executed in Ennis after the IRA ceasefire order. There's none executed after the Dump Arms Order. It's not the end of reprisals. There's quite a few killings around the country after the ceasefire and after the Dump Arms Order. And the most famous is Noel Lamass, the brother of Sean Lamass, later on the Taoiseach of Ireland. In Dublin, there's 3 or 4. There's a guy called McEntee, Cabra, there's a soldier called Joe Bergen. There's a number of killings in Kerry and Cork and so on. And elsewhere, most of these are revenge killings left over from the Civil War on the pro-treaty side. But there are also some pro-treaty troops killed after the Civil War. And quite a few also who died in accidents. So their weapon safety didn't get any better just because there was a ceasefire on. One of the interesting things, though, is there is a big effort in the civilian administration of the Free State after the Civil War to actually exercise legality. Because as we've discussed in the Civil War, this is of a very dubious nature. It's really anything you need to do to win the Civil War, more or less, you're going to do. But afterwards, you see it change. You see them tightening up. You see them executing some of their own, actually, for criminal actions. So there's a former member of the National Army who was executed for a bank robbery in which he shot dead a CID officer in Dublin. There is a soldier executed by hanging, so for a criminal trial, for killing an anti-treatyite in December 23 in Kerry, in Scartiglen. This is very much insisted on by the judiciary. So it's saying you can't let your own side slide anymore, or else, legality will be a joke. There will be no legality. But you do see a lot of hangings after the Civil War in the Free State by the normal criminal methods. And some of them are pro-treaty soldiers and armed robbers and so on. For some of the first Gardaí who were killed in the Civil War were not killed by the IRA at all. They were killed by armed robbers. But you also see a number of hangings for murder. So you see the biggest concentration of hangings in the Free State is also following the Civil War. Some of them are related to Civil War violence, but some of them are also this idea of clamping down on crime, but this time it's strictly within the legal framework. Doing away with this thing of reprisals and lawlessness among your own side.
And finally, to wrap up, John, how have the executions been remembered in the popular memory?
So this is a fascinating thing, So one thing is that for the anti-treatyites, the biggest single reason why the Free State can never be legitimate is the executions. And the number of 77 you see quite early. And so you see, for example, in the Irish Times in 1924, the bodies are handed back. So at the time, the bodies were just buried inside prison grounds and barracks wherever they were shot. They were handed back to the relatives in 24, and they report 77 bodies handed back. So this is the number that's immortalised. Dorothy McCardle, the Republican historian, records that number for posterity. There's also a book called 77 of My Own, Said Ireland, immortalises it forever. Now, there's actually 81 people shot by firing squad by the Free State, formally in the Civil War, but some of them are never claimed by the IRA. There's also cases with people who had broken the IRA's rules, like Hathaway, I mentioned, but also people in Leisure Offaly who were executed for armed robbery who had actually been kicked out of the IRA, and they are welcomed back into the fold posthumously. But it becomes a big deal. I mean, the Republicans put a lot of effort in the 1920s into compiling lists of everyone who was executed and murdered, which is their term, in the Civil War. It becomes a central part of Republican kind of mythology in the Civil War. Now, of course, some of those people got reconciled with the Free State, and they would say transformed the Free State in Fianna Fáil. But particularly in the militant Republican tradition, the executions are a token of why the treaty is wrong and why the Free State is wrong. Because the Free State murdered their own former comrades on the orders of the British, and so this can never be forgiven. So it's a central kind of totemic element of anti-treaty Republican thinking.
And the point is always made that the Free State executed more Republicans than the British did.
And it's true, they did. I mean, when you're really looking through the figures, I think the number of IRA volunteers killed in the War of Independence and the Civil War is actually about the same. And those killed in reprisal by the British forces, the British Army and the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans and so on, might even be more than the Free State. But certainly, yes, in terms of the official executions, 4 times as many by the Free State as by the British.
And we also have the fact that the anti-treatyites were far better at commemorating their victims than the government was, and the pro-treaty side.
Well, that's it. I mean, Anne Dolan wrote a book some time ago now, pointing this out, that the National Army dead died by their lights for a compromise, and so it's very difficult to commemorate them. They'd rather just forget them. Whereas the anti-treaty Republican dead are something, you hold on to bitterly, and they show that you're right in some way for holding to the true cause. So they're given that meaning in later decades. And, things like the National Graves Association have all these memorials, little memorials around the country to the anti-treatyites. And while there are some pro-treaty memorials, there really aren't many.
Well, thanks very much, John. That was very interesting. And if anyone hasn't read John's book about Civil War in Dublin, now is the time to get a copy. So we have covered a lot of these issues before in previous episodes of the show that you can find on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. The podcast of this and previous episodes of the show is available on all the podcast apps like iTunes, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you have a moment, please rate and review the show, as it really, really does help us. So you can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And please let us know what you think of the show, because we love to get your feedback, and please share any of the episodes you find on your social media. It really makes other people aware of the show, and we really appreciate it too. So John has also set up a Patreon for The Irish Story. So if you enjoy reading the articles on the Irish Story website, or our podcast here on the Irish History Show, please consider supporting us on the Patreon, and we really do appreciate that, so thank you very much, and there'll be a link in the show notes. So until next time, my name is Cathal Brennan, and on behalf of myself and my co-presenter John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.